Welcome, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Naomi Alboim, and I'm one of the faculty here at the school. And I am really delighted to welcome everybody here, particularly given Happy Valentine's Day to all, but particularly given that it's the sort of the next to last day before reading week, and I appreciate the fact that all of you have come out instead of getting on trains, planes, and automobiles to go wherever you are going. So delighted to see you all. One of your colleagues, one of the students, is actually going to introduce our speaker, but I just want to give my personal greetings to Glen and welcome him here. I, in fact, was the person who invited him to come. I think the global compacts it was a very interesting process. It's a very interesting approach that was taken. It's become, and Glen will probably talk about this, it's become an issue where it's sort of frankly hard to believe that it has become an issue in some respects. But I'm glad there are some students from my class who will be here because we did talk about this in previous classes and we'll be talking about it again. So having someone who was instrumental in some of the conversations in Canada that led to the development of Canada's position on these documents, and to give us a little bit of behind the scenes look at how instruments like these are negotiated and come to life, sometimes in ways that were unexpected. It will be, I hope, very interesting to you. It was a pleasure getting to know Glen. I was on the, I forget what we were called, but a kind of, thank you, the Canadian Migration Experts Group. So I was on the Canadian Migration Experts Group that met with people both at Glen's department, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, and also with GAC, the Global Affairs Canada organization. Those two organizations were responsible for developing Canada's position for these global compacts and for ultimately negotiating them. So I'm delighted again, and I'm going to pass it on to Manny to do the formal introduction of our speaker.
Good afternoon, students, faculty, and community members, and welcome to the School of Policy Studies. My name is Manny Batwa, and I am an MPA 2019 candidate. It's my pleasure to host this week's policy speaker series. Today's policy talk brings us an exciting guest from the Office of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, the Director General of International and Intergovernmental Relations, Glen Linder. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting today. The territory Kingston sits on has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years, and it is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker, who is responsible for leading Canada's international and domestic relationships in the area of migration, refugee, and citizenship. Glen joined the Federal Public Service as a Foreign Service Officer in Citizenship and Immigration Canada in 1998 and was posted to the Canadian Embassy in Guatemala from 2000 to 2002. On his return, he transferred to the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, where he worked in the Oceans and Environmental Law Division of Legal Bureau for 4 years. That's particularly exciting for me because I'm a biology undergraduate, so I look forward to hearing about that as well as everything else. For 4 years, and then moved over to the Department of Justice, where he joined the Department of Public Safety as Director of the International Affairs Division in 2008. From 2014 to 2016, Glen was Senior Director of Occupational Health and Safety in the Labor Program of Employment and Social Development in Canada, where he was responsible for advancing health and safety legislation, regulations, and compliance in federal jurisdiction workplaces. Today's talk will provide an overview of the recently adopted Global Compact for Migration and Global Compact on Refugees. It will reflect on the process of achieving consensus and on the instruments as well as next steps. We will also be using Slido to ask questions. Please use the hashtag MPA19 to join the discussion. And those that are watching via live stream at home, you can also participate. You just have to join. If you don't have a question, you can also vote questions that you want asked up, and the most popular questions will be asked. And we'll also be taking a few questions at the very end. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Glen Linder.
Thanks so much, Manny. I'm wired. Thanks, Manny, and thanks so much, Naomi. It's great to be with you. It's a beautiful day in Kingston. It's free pizza. It's 2 days till reading week. It's Valentine's Day. I mean, this is sweet, guys, and I'm just delighted to be with you to talk about this really important file that I've been so proud to be part of. So I'm going to just jump right into it. Before getting into the substance of the Global Compact, I want to give you a few facts and figures on global migration. The number of people on the move internationally continues to grow each year. The numbers on this slide are from 2017. In that year, there were about 258 million people living in a country other than their country of birth. This represents an increase of 85 million people since 2000 and approximately 3.4% of the world's population. These movements include those seeking better opportunities, as well as 25.4 million refugees and 3.1 million asylum seekers who've been forcibly displaced, escaping armed conflict, poverty, food insecurity, human rights violations, and persecutions. Some of this displacement was also linked, at the very least indirectly, to climate change. In addition, there's also an estimated 40 million internally displaced persons who had not crossed an international boundary. All this migration brings both challenges and opportunities. It challenges countries of origin with issues of brain drain, and countries of transit and destination with border management and integration issues. It challenges criminal justice systems with the need to do more to address human smuggling and trafficking. It challenges law enforcement and social and health systems to address victimization of migrants. At the same time, it creates opportunities. Migrants now provide more money back to their home countries in the form of remittances than all of the official assistance to development provided by all the rich countries in the world combined. Migrants can make significant economic, social, and cultural contributions to the countries in which they settle, and it's worth noting that the vast majority of migration in the world is regular, not irregular, and a large proportion of it is between countries in the global south. So with that context in mind, let me take you back to 2015. The crisis in Syria captured headlines and emotions around the world. It was the greatest human displacement since World War II, placing massive strains on neighboring countries and waking the world's consciousness to a reality that had been developing mainly in the shadows for many years. I think we all remember that awful, profoundly upsetting photo of the body of 3-year-old Alan Kurdi, his body on the beach in Turkey in September of that year. In addition to the arrivals from Syria, Europe was grappling with how to respond to increased arrivals of refugees and migrants coming across the Mediterranean. A similar challenge was taking place in the Andaman Sea, where Rohingya and other persecuted minorities were looking to escape. All in all, traditional response capacities were already stretched by existing and growing forced and protracted displacement situations in a vast arc of instability stretching from West Africa through the Sahara, the Maghreb, the Middle East, and over to Pakistan and Afghanistan. Countries of transit and destination, particularly in Europe, weren't prepared for this. And this confirmed thinking among many that their governments simply weren't in control of their borders. Populist sentiment that was on the rise in any event grew stronger. In the UK, for example, the UK Independence Party was growing in popularity, making forceful arguments that the UK's membership in the European Union meant that it couldn't control the flow of migrants from Europe into the UK. It was in 2015 that then UK Prime Minister David Cameron responded by promising during the election campaign to hold a referendum on the UK leaving the European Union. It was also in 2015 that Donald Trump announced his candidacy to be the Republican Party's presidential candidate and promised to build a wall to keep irregular migrants out of the United States. It was in this context that countries came together, championed by many countries in Europe, as well as by former President Obama, and decided that a global response was needed. So, at a high-level summit in September 2016 at the UN, states agreed to work together to develop 2 global compacts, one on refugees and one for safe, orderly, and regular migration. In international law, there's a framework for the treatment of refugees dating back to 1951. The Refugee Compact would be rooted in that framework, and consultations on the compact would be led by the United Nations Refugee Agency. There's no similar international legal framework governing migration. There are lots of best practices documents, lots of great material that the International Organization on Migration and other agencies have put out. But the Migration Compact really started from scratch. It was a state-led negotiation that took place at UN headquarters in New York. Consultations and negotiations on both compacts took place over the next 2 years, concluding in the summer of 2018. So what did we end up with? The Global Compact on Refugees serves 2 main purposes. It calls on states to do more responsibility sharing for the growing number of refugees and disproportionately affected states that neighbor on conflict zones. And it puts in place something called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, or CRRF. The CRRF is essentially an inventory of best practices to respond to large-scale refugee movements. For example, it includes practical ways that host countries can integrate refugees into domestic health, education, and labor programs. Canadian objectives during the development of the GCR included advocating for gender, age, and diversity considerations throughout the text, reaffirmation of the international legal framework, and fundamental norms in relation to refugee protection. We also wanted to achieve consensus between donors and refugee host countries. One of Canada's key initiatives is explicitly mentioned in the Global Compact on Refugees, and that is the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative. This is work we're trying to do to get other countries, other developed and middle-income countries, to set up programs for the private sponsorship of refugees, as we have in Canada, in order to increase resettlement spaces worldwide. There's also mention of complementary pathways for refugees in the compact. This is a recognition that many people who may be in refugee camps have skills that are desperately needed in other countries and could usefully contribute to their economies. So rather than bringing these people over as refugees or leaving them in the camps, there are opportunities to bring them over as economic migrants to fill gaps in economies, and this is something that we've done in Canada. The Global Compact on Refugees contains a set of 23 objectives and over 200 examples of action items that cover all aspects of a migration journey, from the decision to migrate through to return and reintegration. Each objective includes commitments which, over time, would contribute to meeting the compact objectives. The actions listed under each commitment are considered a compendium of best practices. The list is not exhaustive, but it's intended to provide guidance to countries as they consider how they might work toward achieving the objectives in the compact. It's important to note that the compact on migration is not binding. This is based on the understanding that as the primary actors in migration decision-making, it's the individual countries themselves that should retain the sovereign rights to determine who enters and stays on their territories and under what conditions, provided that all this is done, of course, in accordance with international legal obligations. Canada was pleased with the outcome of the text, which reflected many of the positions we advanced during negotiations. We developed our positions in consultation with civil society, provinces and territories, and academics. We worked closely during negotiations with a range of countries from all regions, those who we usually share views with, as well as more non-traditional partners, to address a number of issues that were contentious and divisive, including irregular migration. We also promoted gender equality and human rights as key principles throughout the text. Canada was considered a strong and constructive voice throughout the process, building relationships that we hope will continue in international fora as we move forward with implementation. In advance of and during the negotiations, we benefited significantly from a group of experts from Canadian academia and civil society who helped us shape our positions, and that's the Canadian Migration Experts Group that Naomi mentioned. And I'm delighted that Naomi was a key voice in that group, and thank you again, Naomi. So what is the Global Compact on Migration? What are the objectives and best practices contained in the document? Essentially, they cover the elements of the migration system that governments can consider strengthening. So addressing drivers of migration, for example, is key to ensuring the international community is better able to respond to migration. Sustainable development is in countries of origin, and promoting financial inclusion and facilitating remittances are also linked to addressing drivers. Conversely, countries of destination also need to look at their migration systems. The best chance we have of improving the safety, orderliness, and regularity of migration is by both supporting sustainable development and at the same time encouraging more countries to put in place regular pathways for temporary and permanent migration, such as for work, study, and family reunification, and ensuring prospective migrants have information about their options. There's obviously a huge demand for migration in the world, and if more countries can put in place regular pathways for people to migrate to their countries, this will provide alternatives for irregular migration. It will also provide opportunities that migrants are looking for. It'll benefit their countries of origin through remittances, and benefit countries of adoption by filling labor skills gaps and countering aging populations. For those who resort to irregular migration, the GCM calls for effective practices in areas such as saving lives and finding missing migrants, addressing migrant smuggling, and preventing and combating trafficking in persons. The Compact also provides guidance on managing borders in a secure and humane way, ensuring migrants have identity and travel documents, and working towards safe and dignified return for those who do not qualify to stay. Overall, improving the quality of migration data is important so that policymakers can base their policies on reliable and objective evidence. In Canada, we're generally well aligned with the Compact's principles and objectives, and many of the best practices contained in the Compact were taken from things that we do. Canada is in a unique position, though. We're a country built on immigration and with a long history of receiving people, so we've had time to develop our system. So for this reason, we're often asked to share our experiences by other countries, our lessons learned, our good practices, but we also have to have a huge amount of humility about that because our system is certainly far from perfect and we're always looking to improve it. The Global Compact on Refugees was adopted by the General Assembly on November 13th of last year, and the Global Compact on Migration on December 19th. There wasn't much controversy associated with the GCR, but ahead of the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration, there were protests in several European countries, as well as right here in Canada, both in Ottawa and in Edmonton. As someone who's been involved in international work for most of my career, I can tell you that it was pretty surprising to see protests in Canada over a non-binding United Nations document. But it also speaks to the polarized migration debate that we have worldwide, and some would argue increasingly in Canada. So 152 states voted in favor of the Global Compact on Migration, with only 5 opposing it. Those who opposed it cited a few reasons. First, that it infringes on the sovereign right of countries to control their borders in accordance with national laws, that it doesn't sufficiently differentiate between regular and irregular migrants, that it may create legal obligations on states, and that it encourages migration and requires states to increase the number of migrants admitted. Interesting to note that many states that actually voted in favor of the compacts also took pains to make statements making it clear that the compact is non-binding and does not interfere with their sovereignty. But to be clear, the text of the compact explicitly affirms the sovereign right of states to set their own national migration policies. Furthermore, the non-binding nature of the compact means that fulfilling the commitments in it remains voluntary and dependent on each country's national reality, capacity, policies, and priorities. Each country retains the flexibility to implement the compact in a way that works best for them. So, as I said, Canadian practices are generally well aligned with both compacts. Under the GCR, I already mentioned the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative and our complementary pathways work. Under the GCM, Canada already has programming in place that furthers some of the objectives of the compact. For example, we have a pilot project that seeks to improve labor market outcomes and advance the careers of newcomer and visible minority women in order to reduce vulnerabilities of migrants. We've put in place a communications campaign called Immigration Matters, through which the Government of Canada is collecting and telling stories from communities across the country that provide examples of how migrants are making contributions to Canada's economy and society. We also have in place a pilot project to establish a migrant worker support network to better inform temporary foreign workers about their rights and provide assistance in instances of abuse or exploitation. We've increased our capacity building fund to fund migration-related capacity building in other countries, as well as migration research. And we have a program in place called the Global Skills Strategy, which provides faster processing of work permits for high-skilled individuals and eliminates the requirement for select individuals to hold a work permit in order to work in Canada for shorter periods. So what's next? The Migration Compact includes mechanisms for follow-up, review, and implementation. It endorses the creation of a UN network on migration, coordinated by the International Organization for Migration, to provide effective and timely support to states in the implementation of the Global Compact on Migration. The Compact also establishes an International Migration Review Forum that will evaluate national plans and progress on GCM implementation. The forum is set to meet every 4 years, starting in 2022. As for the Refugee Compact, in 2019, the UN Refugee Agency will lead the development of indicators that will permit states to measure progress in the GCR's implementation. In late 2019, the agency will convene the first Global Refugee Forum, a quadrennial event established by the GCR that will take stock of progress towards the Compact's objectives and allow member states the opportunity to exchange best practices and experiences. Countries now have the opportunity to implement the global compacts in a meaningful way. By better managing migration in each national context, there's hope that we can work to harness the benefits of migration and address the challenges of irregular migration. But that will take a lot of work and a lot of political will, and the sentiments of the public in all the key countries will obviously be taken into account. So I'm going to stop there and happy to take any questions.
They're just getting the questions. They're there.
So I'll just read out the first question. If you could make any aspects of the Global Compact legally binding, which would they be?
Might refer that one to Naomi, actually. Any aspects of the Global Compact legally binding? Yeah, that's a great one. Certainly there are references in there to binding instruments, to to human rights instruments and to protocols, to UN documents associated with combating trafficking in persons and migrant smuggling. Those are in there. Those are referenced in there already. It's really challenging. It's really challenging to put anything in a migration compact that's specifically on migration that's legally binding. And the reason for that is this. One of the most fundamental attributes of the sovereignty of a state is its right to control who comes into and stays in its country. That's fundamental to any country. And if you try in any way to kind of jeopardize that or to put that at risk, it really becomes unacceptable very quickly. And so it's for that reason that the compact, that there was consensus right from the beginning that it had to be non-binding. You know, if I had my personal wish list, things like having in place regular pathways for migration, because we know, based on evidence, that every country who has taken in migrants, which is basically every country, has benefited from their presence, provided they do a good job in integrating them and not marginalizing them. So to me, regular pathways should be something that every country puts in place, because it's a reality. People will move. These days, it's more easier than ever to move from one place to another. And so to me, that to me is one of the most fundamental things in there, and I would really love to see more countries, all countries, put that in place.
Cool. Thank you. So the next question, how did public opinion and public views on migrants, refugees, etc. affect your role/job when creating the Global Compact?
So as public servants, we obviously we obviously serve our government, and so we take our instructions from the government of the day, and we are obviously aware of what's happening in the public, but our political masters are very much attuned to that. And so we do take, so we obviously often consulted with our minister in terms of the progress on the Global Compact, and we were aware of the changing views. In Canada, things were fairly stable up until towards the end. I mean, there wasn't much coverage in Canada of the Global Compact itself, but certainly in other countries, we were aware that there were rumblings, and we heard about this on the floor of the negotiations. So at the beginning, as I mentioned, there was this huge political will to get the Global Compacts done, to do something that was really progressive, to put it in place. As negotiations rolled through 2017 and 2018, you could tell that the mood in the negotiations was changing. People were forgetting some of those lessons from 2015. They were more caught up in what was happening in the debates in their home countries. And so you had some tough negotiations where some perhaps stronger provisions that many countries would have liked to have seen be included ended up being watered down. And so, as a result of that, you still have a great instrument. I mean, when you consider the context in which we're operating internationally with respect to migration, the fact that we were able to get to international agreement on 2 compacts on these very controversial subjects right now is a remarkable achievement. But certainly the changing public opinion, less so in Canada, but in other countries, certainly affected the final text of the compact.
So maybe we'll take one more question and then we can switch over to the audience and maybe flip-flop back and forth. So the next question, is Canada being overpressured by the United Nations to accept more refugees than its infrastructure and support mechanisms can handle?
I would say the answer to that is no. Canada has a very solid relationship with the UNHCR. We work very closely with them on needs. We also are very clear in terms of how many refugees we will take. In Canada, we have a levels plan for immigrants and refugees that's tabled in Parliament every year. We now have a multi-year levels plan where we predict out 3 years how many immigrants and refugees we'll take. So we make it very clear how many there'll be. And so we establish that, the UNHCR respects that, and we work together to identify the needs and those that are best able to and those that we're best able to accommodate. In Canada, we have a network of support organizations across the country that we fund in order to help refugees with their integration. And the funding we give to those organizations is based on the levels that have been tabled in Parliament. So everything lines up. And so we're able to fund in Canada the amount that we've said we're going to take. And so with that kind of clarity and transparency for everyone, there are not a lot of surprises. That said, when it comes to privately sponsored refugees, there continues to be huge demand from Canadians to privately sponsor refugees to come in. I mean, Operation Syrian Refugees in particular was a huge success story in terms of people wanting to sponsor refugees, wanting to accompany them and to ensure their success, and that demand has continued. So we do have large numbers of requests for private sponsorship, and we have our levels numbers. We're not going to exceed our levels numbers published in Parliament. So that inevitably means that the wait for folks who are looking to sponsor refugees is longer than is ideal.
All right, so questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Just a follow-up on your last statement here. How do these refugees, what are some of the major problems that they confronted coming into the Canadian community in terms of jobs, education? What are their needs? Have you heard those problems? How do you recognize?
So I guess I'll just repeat the question. The question was essentially what are the major needs that we see among the refugee population that comes into Canada. So I should start with a caveat that this is not my area of expertise, but I have certainly heard that in terms of the needs, language is obviously a major need in terms of learning our official languages in order to be able to fully participate in Canadian society and the Canadian economy. So it's for that reason that we really do a lot of work in terms of funding and putting in place language classes for refugees. There's also education needs, particularly for the kids. And this often is up to the provinces to be able to deal with, because obviously schools are under provincial jurisdiction, and when you get refugee families, and sometimes when there's larger families, it can be challenging for school boards to accommodate large families where the kids may not have English or French, and so that can be a challenge as well. And then with the refugee population, as you can imagine, sometimes there's more vulnerability than in your regular migrant population. And so there sometimes needs to be additional supports. I mean, people will have gone through traumatic events sometimes. And so putting in place those supports to make sure folks have access to that is important. And then counseling in terms of assistance to enter the job market, counseling in order to find employment, counseling in order to understand how you put a resume together for the Canadian job market. It's things that we know how they work. We understand how our society works and what's required. But for refugees, And oftentimes for other immigrants as well, it's important to make sure that they have these supports so that they really can integrate and fully participate in the Canadian economy. I think it's, notwithstanding our great efforts with respect to settlement and integration programming, I think it's also fair to say that so much integration happens in our schools and in the workplace. It doesn't happen it happens because people are in our classes and getting the counseling that we provide, but it happens best with kids in schools, engaging with their peers, with adults in the workplace on a day-to-day basis. And so those are some of the success stories that we see.
Any other questions, guys? Okay, maybe we'll go back to Slido while you guys think of some more. So the next question, what does the Global Compact provide about improving domestic situations leading to refugees and migrants? What is Canada doing?
What does the Global Compact provide about improving domestic situations leading to refugees and migrants? So the Global Compact, it's essentially a list of about 200 best practices that countries can adopt or not in terms of managing migration. And so, when you look at these practices as you go through the Global Compact, there are many of them that Canada already does, and there's some that are in there that we would be likely less interested in pursuing, certainly in the short term. So, when you look at settlement and integration programming that we just talked about, that's in there. When you look at providing pathways for migration, that's in there. So documentation, making sure that people have access to health care, all those things are in there. And so Canada is largely consistent. I guess but there are also things in there where we're not consistent, and I don't think we would go down the route of looking at these things, certainly not in the short term. For example, there's one provision in there that says that if you have someone in your country as a temporary foreign worker, you should always give them, I'm simplifying it, but it says you should always give them an open work permit so that they can go from job to job to job and do whatever they like. And so we have a fairly well-regulated system with respect to temporary foreign workers because we want to ensure that temporary foreign workers come in and fill labor market needs where Canadians are not available to do so or not willing to do so. And so as a result of that, I can't imagine a situation where we would open up our temporary foreign worker regime completely to allow any temporary foreign worker to come in and take any job. We would continue to have labor market assessments for certain positions, and we would continue to have, in some categories at least, temporary foreign workers coming in and having them able to work for the specific company or the specific region of the country that their permit applies to. So those are some examples of where we're consistent and where we're not, or where we're less consistent.
What policy changes could Canada make in the short term to better integrate refugees, labor, language, culture?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we do in this space, certainly is in terms of our settlement and integration programming that we provide to refugees, in terms of counseling and classes on the Canadian job market, on language, on just teaching them the basics. But really, our privately sponsored refugee model is something that many countries emulate, and it truly is amazing. When you have, for example, a group of 5 Canadians who personally take it on themselves to help out a refugee family for a year, this is an incredible model that's been adopted by a few other countries now as well, where you have a family that is surrounded, basically hugged by Canadians who understand the system and who provide them those supports and are there for them every day. And the outcomes we see from these privately sponsored refugees the outcomes are much better than for the regular government-assisted refugees, in fact, because they are so supported throughout their entire journey. So government does a significant amount of programming with respect to refugees. And we do what we can as government, but where you see the real impact is through the attitudes of Canadians themselves with respect to refugees. And whether it's sponsorship, whether it's really ensuring that we continue to have a society where discrimination is not tolerated, where people are integrated and included. It's those actions of Canadians every day that really are the key to successful integration of refugees and immigrants generally, I would argue.
Can we quantify the impact for follow-up and review of implementation?
No.
I think that was
That's a
asked.
good question.
Right?
The question is, can we read the top one again?
Oh, okay. Can we quantify the impact that the compact has had since its inception?
This might sound quite cynical, but I don't think that the compact has had a huge impact since its inception. It's only been around a couple of months. I think countries are still digesting it to some extent. I think some of those protests we saw in the lead up to the adoption of the compact were a little bit scary for some countries, in fact. But I think that as countries review this, in the fullness of time, they will see that the contents of the compact are simply practical strategies that countries can adopt in order to improve their migration systems to confront the challenges of migration and take advantage of the opportunities of migration. So I think the impact has been the positive impact has certainly been little so far. I think there's been something of a negative impact in terms of people focusing on the global compact as something to be worried about. But at the same time, I think that on review, I think even some countries that will have been opposed to it would look through the list of objectives in the compact and would see themselves reflected in much of what's in there in terms of the content of it. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time, but it really is. I think many of us have the hope that it'll provide a bit of a roadmap for countries to really look at their systems and make some improvements. I can tell you that, from my perspective at Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada in Ottawa, we get contacted on a weekly basis, sometimes more frequently, from other countries who are looking to engage with us to understand how we do immigrant selection, how we do settlement and integration, our visa issuing processes, our passport issuing processes, all these things, because they want to learn from us in order to improve their systems. These are all things that are in the Global Compact on Migration. Whether countries reference it or not, there's a keen interest to do more in the sphere of migration, and that's exciting. We host delegations from other countries. We have representatives in our embassies in other countries that provide this kind of support as well. And then we provide capacity building and workshops to many countries in order to be able to provide them the tools to improve their migration systems as well. So I think things are changing. Whether credit is given to the Global Compact or not will be something we'll determine. But I think people are realizing, countries are realizing that there is more that they can each do individually to harness the benefits of migration and address the challenges.
It looks like we have some audience questions.
Thanks. I was wondering if there was anything unique about resistance within Canada to the Global Compact vis-a-vis resistance within other countries that are supporting it?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I don't know exactly where the motivation in other countries versus Canada comes from. I think there's a general discomfort, a growing discomfort about migration issues generally. I think that there's always concern. Citizens are always concerned about whether their government is properly controlling borders, the migration system, and so on. Whether or not there's foundation to those fears or not, that will depend from one country to another. But I will say that I had not seen, up until the time of the Global Compact, I had not seen this kind of reaction to any kind of UN initiative with respect to migration or refugees, certainly in my career. So that would be a great question to answer in a master's thesis, though. It's a fantastic question.
So it looks like we have time for one more short question if anyone would like to ask.
Just a quick question. What are the major issues of returns?
Returns, in terms of returning people to their countries of origin? What are the major issues? Well, I mean, Canada does return people, obviously, those who have, for example, come to Canada, overstayed their visas, come to Canada, committed acts of criminality, those who've come, applied for asylum, found not to qualify, exhausted all their appeals. We do return people to their countries of origin frequently. We have, obviously, what's super important to us and to many other countries is that due process, making sure people are able to have their case treated fairly throughout the system. There are multiple levels of appeal and review that are possible. So the system can be time consuming, but that due process element is important. At the same time, there is a need to do that quickly, and so those are some of the challenges in terms of returns. The other challenge that we sometimes experience and is in terms of the countries of origin themselves. Sometimes the individual won't have a travel document, a passport, that'll enable them to travel internationally, and so we have to work with that country of origin in order to get them to issue the travel document to return the individual. And sometimes they're reluctant to do so. Certainly the United States is very public about concerns it has with specific countries and sometimes imposes sanctions on countries for not issuing travel documents for people it wants to return. And so that can be, so once you've gone through the whole process, it can be a bit of a challenge if you can't get that travel document as well from the country. But we try to work effectively with diplomatic missions and with those countries in order to get them to issue the travel documents. But it is a complex area for sure.
Any other questions, guys?
You mentioned some of the concerns that countries have regarding state sovereignty, even if the global compacts are
Yeah.
not. Do you see, out of the countries that refused to sign or to approve the global compact, and as well as countries that refused to sign the agreement in Marrakesh, do you see a certain philosophy of why countries are so against this apart from the state sovereignty? Because
it's really difficult. It's really difficult to see an objective concern there because the Global Compact has two really clear provisions on this. The one is it's really clear that it operates without prejudice to the sovereignty of any country. And the other one is that it's really clear that countries continue to have the right to determine who enters and remains on their territory. So objectively, it's tough to understand the concern, but nonetheless, the concern is out there and it's been raised. We have attempted, as best as we can, to explain to countries that that it shouldn't be an area of concern. I can tell you that from Canada's perspective, we were the country that insisted on putting that language in there, actually, because we heard about this concern from other countries. Obviously, we had similar concerns of our own, but we heard about that concern from other countries, and it's for that reason that we championed putting some of that language in the Global Compact. The thing about the evolution and the development of international law is it's very much dependent on state practice. So if states continue to treat the Global Compact as non-binding, as I'm sure they will, it will remain non-binding, and it would take a remarkable swing in state practice to have large parts of the Global Compact become customary international law, for example. I just don't foresee that happening. But there are those who would argue that there's a slippery slope there, but it's a pretty long slope, and I don't think it's particularly slippery. Those are the concerns.
So you kind of touted like the private refugee sponsorship program as like the gold star or like the gold standard for other programs to have like. But there's currently a certain backlog in terms of how many families can come into a country and how many can be processed. Do you see any way to speed up that or like to reduce that backlog or make the process a little bit quicker so people can come into Canada?
Yeah, it really is an issue of level space. We publish the number that we'll let in any given year by category, including for privately sponsored, and it really is the current government's strong preference, as was the case honestly with the previous government, that we have a significant number of immigrants that we admit to Canada be economic immigrants, high-skilled immigrants, those who have education, those who can speak our language, for example. And the reason we do that is because we see the positive economic impact on Canada of having those economic immigrants. And so, there's a trade-off there. Yeah, you could increase your levels for refugees, for privately sponsored, but it's a finite number ultimately that we're dealing with. And so there's a trade-off there. If you increase refugees, you're going to have less economic. I mean, we're in a situation where we've got a 3-year plan that very gradually increases the levels of both over time. But it's also a question of keeping faith with the Canadian public in terms of ensuring that our immigration system is well managed and that we're controlling the numbers that are coming in a way that's supported by the economic and social evidence. So there are trade-offs there. You could do more, but these are political decisions, hopefully informed by objective data.
Any other questions from the audience? Yep.
Well, it's come up a couple of times. I think it's obvious that this is one of those areas of public policy or domestic public opinion that really matters. Not just for political reasons. There's lots of reasons why it really matters. And there's lots of different published opinion surveys out there. And I'm sure you guys are doing lots of your own public opinion research. I was wondering if you could tell me, is there a view within Citizenship and Immigration Canada on whether or not public attitudes towards refugees has shifted in any way meaningfully in the last, let's say, 3 years, since the Syrian intake, and then all the other stuff you read about in the media, the anecdotal stuff. So let's say that's kind of the reflection point. Because some surveys say there is significant changes going on, others say not so much. What's the considered view? I imagine this is something that you pay attention to.
Yeah, I haven't seen any recent data, but I can say that maintaining support for our immigration system is something that is very important to the government, and the reason for that is simple. We see the benefits to Canada of it in terms of the economy in particular, and so in order to really ensure that Canadians understand the benefits, not only do we have what we call our open data portal, which has all kinds of data and objective evidence in terms of the impact of migration on Canada's economy. We also understand that for some people, that objective evidence is less compelling than anecdotal evidence. And so we've just recently launched a campaign called Immigration Matters, where you can look on our website and we're collecting stories from across the country in terms of those positive impacts that immigrants and refugees are having across the country. So yes, we're concerned, but we're also doing something about it in terms of ensuring that, in terms of doing our best to demonstrate through objective evidence and that anecdotal evidence the benefits of migration.
Does the Global Compact create mechanisms for follow-up and review of implementation?
Yeah, so that was, I guess I don't have it there, but there is definitely follow-up and review for both global compacts. For the Global Compacts on Migration, we've got the International Migration Review Forum, and that'll get together every 4 years and review states' implementation of it. Of course, it'll be up to states to determine for themselves how robust they are in engaging on that. And for the Global Compact on Refugees, starting in 2019, starting this year, there'll be something called the Global Refugee Forum that, again, will monitor the implementation of that Global Compact.
Given a more volatile international order, how do you see the Global Compacts maturing and evolving in the coming years?
Yeah, this is the million-dollar question. It'll be really, really interesting to see the extent to which they're taken up explicitly versus the extent to which the content of the Global Compacts is taken up but without referencing them explicitly. And so it'll be very, very interesting to see. Certainly, I think we can say that with respect to the migration debate, I think this question has it absolutely right. Things are getting more volatile and more challenging. So we'll have to watch the space and see. I don't have a crystal ball on this one, but it certainly does look like a challenging time.
All right, everyone, so that concludes our talk for today. Thank you for coming here all the way to Queens and giving us the inside scoop on such a hot topic issue. I just want to say thank you on behalf of the class and everyone here, and
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Manny. Real pleasure to be with you all today.